What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. It's day one. Let's take a look at the decks that are excelling in this all-new meta. With the changes to Hela and Clog, I think it's become clear in the immediate day one that there are a couple of strategies that stand a little bit above the rest. This is a metagame that moves very, very fast, and we are a little bit almost traveling back in time. Because, if you'll recall, Hela and Clog formed a bit of a triumvirate with Bounce, and then those decks were all sort of chased out by the Iron Man stuff. With less Clog in the game, with less Hela in the game, Bounce ends up being perfectly threatening on its own. It is also day one. Many people are cooking, trying to figure out what to do. You can simply just play an already perfectly chefed Bounce deck that you already know how to play and really start collecting those wins. I personally like this version of the Bounce deck the most into an open metagame, but by the time this video comes out, which is only really going to be like 8 to 10 hours after I record it, there may be advancements being made. As always, the flex plots here involve getting Shadow King into the deck. That is usually the thing that sticks out. Alternatively, if you don't want to get Shadow King into the deck, Shadow King good against mirrors, you can also try to get US Agent into the deck, which is going to be better against the Iron Man lists that are going to be able to compete with you on points. The general thing this deck does is very similar to what it's always done. Bounce is the level 1 deck in this metagame, the first option for putting the most points on the board, and it's no surprise that it was very successful with the first few days of this format. I would expect it to remain successful, but there is one thing to keep in mind. After the release of Agent Venom, Bounce was the sort of flavor of the week. It was the very, very strong, very, very good list that everyone was playing, and that sort of started to drag it down. When everyone plays a list like this, you get a target on your back, and people start building to actually try to beat you. That is the worry for anyone investing in Bounce right now, that they will, by the time people are watching this video, realize that this is the sort of number one deck that people have to aim at, and figure out ways to actually try to deal with it. The other thing that Bounce has not going for it right now is a large volume of Cosmo in the metagame. Cosmo is still absolutely a monster, and it's very specifically good against Bounce decks because of the way they tend to throw priority and rely on cards like Sage and Hitmonkey on the final turns of the game. I'm not saying it's gonna make all those matchup worries go away, but if you're already pairing it with powerful points packages like in the AV Iron Man deck, I would expect that you end up on the losing side of those matchups if you're playing Bounce. The Agent Venom Iron Man deck was tempered in the fires of the previous metagame, having to deal with things like Hela and Clog being major parts of the game. That is no longer true. I ran into very few functional Clog decks and very few functional Hela decks. This is still a deck that holds up. It's holding up against a more unknown variety of decks than anything it's had to face before. The main thing that this deck is doing is pairing a good Cosmo deck with an effective and efficient points engine. A lot of people wonder about the deck construction, but to me it's actually fairly straightforward. What this deck wants to do is play as many efficient points cards as it possibly can that all benefit from Agent Venom. Then, what it wants to do on top of that is figure out how to create the largest and most confusing boards that it can, get ahead, copy either an Iron Man or a Claw with Mystique, and then Cosmo something else. The vast majority of turn 6 interaction, and really most turn 6 cards in Marvel Snap right now, are vulnerable to Cosmo. Whether that be hitting a Hazmat out of an Ajax deck, hitting a Sage out of a Bounce deck, Cosmo is going to be doing a lot of meaningful disruption when you play this list. Fundamentally, what this deck is a collection of very good stats cards and the interaction that is, of the moment, Cosmo. That has always been a good recipe. What's different about this deck compared to previous points and interaction decks is that the point ceiling on this deck is actually higher because of the Iron Men. Now, that is not necessarily always a strength. The point ceiling is higher because of the Iron Man, and you are also a little bit more vulnerable and predictable on the final few turns of the game due to that inclusion. This is not a deck where there's anything more than just like 50-50s and reads. You're not really outskilling people. You're winning through brute force and card placement. A very straightforward, very well-known deck. And if you asked me what I thought my pick for the #1 deck would be like over the course of the week, what I would say the early favorite to be the first deck on my tier list on when that's going to come out on Sunday, I would say that it is this list. A powerful, interactive package with great stats and great ability to be confusing with it. Many people wonder if they should pick up Speed or Silver Sable for this deck. I think both of them are far better than their replacements, but not necessarily going to be worth actually spending the tokens on. If you don't have Speed, the best replacement I've seen in terms of things that make sense is probably Hope Summers. And if you don't have, of course, Silver Sable, I think you're going to want to just look for another utility 1-drop. It's going to be worse, but that's okay. Iceman or Spider-Ham will still be able to be helpful and still be good when you get an Agent Venom on the board. Now, there is a big power spike when you play Agent Venom on 2, and depending on your matchup, you will want to consider snapping it there, especially if you have a lot of stuff in the deck that works really well with AV. Specifically, Iron Man and Mystique are the things you're most looking for. As far as deck recommendations, this is actually probably #1 on my list right now. This list was put together by Ica, and it is one of the few decks that I have played with Scream that I did not immediately hate. And a lot of this is that it fuses itself fairly well into the Storm War Machine Legion plan. In the absence of Clog, Storm War Machine Legion is likely to take on a bit of a larger prominence because Clog and Storm War Machine Legion occupied a fairly similar status, right? They were doing the same kind of thing, but now there only is one good way to do that. The Clog decks are not really reconstituting themselves just yet. We'll see if they're able to, but I haven't played against any Clog decks that actually felt all that scary so far. So without that in the game, if you want to prevent people from going drastically over the top of you with Iron Man and bounce stuff, the best way to do that is going to be with Storm War Machine Legion. Spoiler alert, there is another Storm War Machine Legion deck on this list. I like this one because it is unexpected, because you have so many ways of making the Storm location into a win regardless of what's happening, and because Hela is not in the game, which was a major depressive force on decks with Scream. Now, what I mean by winning those Storm locations, even when you're not War Machine Legioning them, is that you get a lot of different options for how you want to play this stuff out. You can have a Scream on the location that you Storm. You can play a War Machine and then win that location even without Legioning, or you can just use your Arrow and your Magneto to pull stuff off of that location so you're never actually in doubt of losing it no matter what. This is a good way of making use of what the deck is already trying to do. That is to say, because you have Storm, you are now able to deal with some of the things that go over the top of you, because you some of the time just instantly win against them, and the rest of the time, I mean, it's not like Bounce is a good deck into the card Storm. You are going to be able to try to win that matchup just straight up, even if you have a Storm, even if you don't have the combo. So you have this thing that's sort of lowering the ceiling of your opponents that sometimes instantly wins you the game against everything, and is wedded to a functional mid-range strategy that finally lost the biggest predator of functional mid-range strategies, Hela, and then like the second biggest predator of functional mid-range strategies, Clog. And so without those in the metagame, it actually is so much more acceptable to just curve out with decent numbers. The second Storm War Machine Legion is, of course, just the drink. It's the same deck that it's been for forever now at this point. We are all familiar with how this deck plays out. It is an attempt at utilizing Madam Web and that as the points package in your Storm War Machine Legion deck. Just a very, very strong, very consistent deck that has been at or near the top of the High Infinite leaderboards since its inception. The fact that you can have both Cosmo and Alioth, the fact that they can move around, gives you a sort of unparalleled level of confusion that your opponents have to deal with on those final turns of the game. It is very hard to play against the turn 6 from this deck unless you are doing something that does not care about each of those cards. And a lot of the things in the game right now care a lot about each of those cards. This deck has matchups and sort of games that as they play out, they become sort of unlosable, where you just have these big movers running around, and you can also move a Cosmo around, and you can also play an Alioth. And that's like not even the A plan here. The A plan is you combo off with Storm, right? You have those games too. And then you have like the plan that is the fusion of those plans, where you're not comboing off with Storm, but you're winning a Storm lane because you are better able to deal with a Storm lane than anything else. And then you just like play an Alioth or an Infinite, and then you just win another lane, right? So this deck is able to do all sorts of different things, which means that to me, it is one of the highest skill testing decks in the entire game right now. You have to commit to one of those game plans early and then see it through. And that does require some vision. You have to say, all right, I think I know what my opponent is doing. Here are the options they have in front of me. I'm going to lock this up. And I'm going to set up a situation that they cannot escape from, but they don't know that, right? And that is how you have to play this game. Now, you also have a lot of leeway with your snaps, because sometimes you're like snapping a Storm War Machine Infinite, and then you draw the Legion, and then you just win anyway. There are a shocking amount of people who will stay into like Storm War Machine snaps, and I think that that's not necessarily the wrong thing to do, because if you start retreating to them all the time, it just ends up being like, okay, I guess I never beat that, and they only have it 13% of the time. Like, it is something you really do have to think about, but there is something to be said for having a combo that wins the game, having multiple game plans built in that sort of branch off of that combo, so that no matter what combination of cards you have in your hand, you're going to be getting something that functions. There are some fail states in this deck, where like you have like half of the cards that do one thing and half of the cards that do the other thing, but they are a lot less common than you would think that they are. This deck is very often able to back itself out of corners that it might be in, and because of the nearly unparalleled player agency in it, the better you are, the better it'll be to you. While we're talking about move decks just a little bit, I wanted to highlight this one, which arrived in a previous metagame that had to deal with a lot more crap, and I think right now might actually be a very solid time for it. It's a fairly intricate aggro deck, but one thing that I've noticed on day one at least, and I do expect this to change, is that there is a lot of Cosmo and not nearly as much Shadow King. And this deck is very, very good into a world where it's facing up against other Cosmo decks. This is a deck that is effectively an aggro deck. What it wants to do is just put a bunch of points on the board, commit to a Havoc that's usually going to be like 12, and then just kind of go to town if you're going to be able to do that. It's a very solid Agent Venom deck that I think has a lot of reasonable upside over the bounce decks, but most of what that upside is it is able to be a Madam Web Cosmo deck, right? That specific thing is what makes this deck a threat. This is a deck that has a similar profile to the bounce decks, but probably tops out a little bit lower in most cases, but has Madam Web and Cosmo to make a lot of different matchups a lot harder for your opponents to deal with. This deck has a lot of power in it. A lot more than you're expecting, especially if they're able to get a Human Torch going. This deck can do a bunch of damage and has good interaction. Downside, I feel that it's very hard to play and even harder to snap, because you are making plays that are sacrificing your future value, which means you need to know when you play this Havoc on turn 4 that you're gonna be okay the rest of the game. That's hard to know. It's a hard call to ask people to make. And I don't necessarily want people to be looking at this deck and not understanding why they're not doing well with it, with that being the reason. Big boys are a strategy that is very close to my heart as a big boy myself. US Agent is a card that I've been very high on recently, and this is a list put together by Batman that finally we got the US Agent in there with the absence of Hela and Clog in the metagame. It becomes a lot easier to do that. This is a deck that just wants to do numbers, but it wants to do them in a unique and awkward way. And also, of course, you'll notice, has Cosmo. One of the major through lines in this metagame right now is that everything you play against, some of these cards in here are going to be completely busted against. If you are someone who is playing a lot of 1, 2, 3s, and 4s, 1s, 2, and 3s, you are going to get blown out by Man-Thing. Every card in the bounce deck gets hit by Man-Thing. Most of the cards in the Iron Man deck get hit by Man-Thing. Almost every card in a lot of decks right now is getting hit by Man-Thing. And then there's this additional bit where when the cards that aren't being hit by Man-Thing get hit by US Agent, it's even better, right? Because you hit an Iron Man with a US Agent, you are nuking that card. Iron Man being a big part of the metagame is very good for US Agent. It's very good for Hazmat. Downsides of this list include, there are some weaknesses to Cosmo. Not as many as in other decks like it, but you are still a Shadow King Hazmat deck and you can lose to Cosmo, right? Like, that is a risk that you're running. You also have to really plan out where your points are going, because you don't want to really be putting your Mockingbird in the same lane as your US Agent unless you have a loot cage, and so you have to plan for those eventualities as they go along, meaning that when you start making these commitments, you might draw the loot cage, you might not, and you need to figure out whether or not it makes sense regardless of the situation and what odds you feel comfortable taking on getting that card into your hand. Generally speaking, though, this deck takes a similar form to the others. And you are able to see right now, I think, that there is a sort of through line developing in what is succeeding early in the metagame. Powerful decks that have Cosmo. Now, there is some nuance here because this one, to me, is built to be good into the Agent Venom Iron Man deck. So it's trying to go a little bit a level above. If AV Bounce is level 1 of the metagame and AV Iron Man is level 2, this would be level 3. It's an attempt at dealing with both at the same time, and it has been successful not just for Batman, but also for Barzy, who have been really, really doing well with a list that looks almost exactly like this. The deck is straightforward, the power is obvious, and the specifics of why it makes sense in this metagame, a lot of that is down to Man-Thing and US Agent, and I think that is the thing that I really want to drill down on here. Man-Thing, US Agent, Hazmat, Ajax. I am 100% positive that one of the builds that uses those 4 cards is going to be extremely strong over the next little bit of Marvel Snap, because that is one of the few ways you can feel like you're actually gonna dominate those Iron Man Agent Venom decks. Now, I realize a lot of people click on these videos with a bit of a mistaken understanding of what they are. So I do want to clarify that explicitly here. These videos are not an exhaustive rundown of what the meta is going to be forever. These videos are like my 7 or 8 front runners for what I like. And that is not to say that there are no other viable decks. I'm not going to sit here and say that, right? But what I notice a lot is people will make comments on videos like this, on the Day 1 decks videos, and be like, wow, nothing changed. Those are the same decks. And it's like, okay, look, that's what happens on Day 1 a lot of the time. Like, just being real with you, that's what happens. Because it takes a longer period of time for decks that aren't fully flushed out to be able to be worked into a position to compete with the decks that are. That's the issue. Now, I think that is not necessarily a reason to give up on them, but it does mean that it's much harder for a new archetype to make it onto a Day 1 video because they're just so unpolished right now. And I think this deck is a great example of something that might be good and people should look at, but it needs a little bit of, like, a little bit of love, a little bit of, let's figure out what our plans are against the various matchups that we're going to see. Let's do what we can do to make them into favorable matchups. I've had decks like this on the top decks list before. I highlighted this one, I think, last week. And it's cooked up by Yo Woody, and he sort of refers to it as like a bit of a Nomura Cope deck, and it kind of is. But there is something to this, and it's not just on here because it has cards that people just opened, but it is here to point out that it's a lot harder to be a fully fledged great deck when you are playing a card that just came out in Misery, a card that came out a little bit ago in Scarlet Spider, a card that came out last month in Symbiote Spider-Man, and a card that just got reworked in Zabu. It takes a while for people to understand what makes cards strong. As far as Zabu decks, this one is by far the one that I have seen that is the scariest and is the most legit. I've seen a lot of Zabu decks that people are trying like Sarah stuff with. Not scary, not really worried about that, although it could be a very good option if enough people start playing the bounce stuff. It does seem like a reasonable thing, but frankly, there's kind of a lot of Cosmo in the metagame for me to feel confident putting a Sarah deck on here. So this is what's making it. A very powerful deck with confusing outcomes available to it, but the major thing that's going to be holding you back, if any, is your lack of a Cosmo, your lack of a Shadow King, right? That is, it's not the end of the world, but you are fundamentally just doing points. But what you do get out of this deck is the ability to do points in a way that other people's interaction is not very good against. You aren't vulnerable to Cosmo the way other decks are. You can be, depending, but a turn 6 Cosmo is the most common way of seeing it, right? Turn 6 Cosmo is not good against this deck. You don't care. It's the other turns when they're Cosmoing you that you start to have a problem. But that requires them to go off curve, right? Like, so there is something to this deck being good and relatively less affected by Cosmo. Of course, though, if they know what you're doing, they're going to Cosmo the crap out of your Symbiote Spider-Man lane, and when you try to do the Nomura stuff, they're going to get you. So you need to play around that stuff. And I think that's going to trip more people up than you'd think. Because Cosmo is a part of the metagame, you can play in ways that leave you less vulnerable to it. If you think you're going to get Cosmoed, make the second best play so you don't get Cosmoed, right? Like, that seems pretty straightforward, right? But it is a hard thing to keep in mind. And I'm not saying you always need to play around it, but like if you're playing against someone who's doing like Agent Venom Thena stuff, and you think they're like kind of smart enough to Cosmo you, play around it. You should probably do that. And I think that that is ultimately what will cost people who play this deck, is that you do have to actually be pretty good when you weigh this into the metagame, because it's not vulnerable to turn 6 Cosmos, but it's very vulnerable to them a little bit earlier. And all of that said, it is still a deck that has Killmonger in it. You can blow up a lot of those 1-drops against bounce decks. There are a lot of 1-drops running around in other decks as well. You are able to do a lot of generally strong stuff, put a lot of points on the board. Your interaction interacts differently than every other deck's interaction right now, because we've talked about just how everything is Cosmo. This deck is a little bit different. It's doing different things. And I do think that it has a lot of ability to put big numbers on the board, get a cheap Scar, and if you're a smart player, win a lot of games. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I did want to put a little bit of a note at the end. These are 7 decks that I really like. I used several of them to climb a bunch already. But I don't want people to watch this video and come away with the theory that nothing else is viable. I am actually worried about the impact of my day 1 videos because of that, because I am trying to cover what the baseline for the metagame is and what you should be expecting to see if you want to try to brew and beat it, right? And I worry that a lot of the time people look at these videos and they're like, KM, there's so many Series 5 cards here. And it's like, dude, that's because it's like 7 decks that I really like. If I was specifically focusing on trying to get 20 decks in here, yeah, I could get Destroy and Zoo in here too. Them not being on here is not indication that they're not good. It's an indication that you probably already know about Destroy and Zoo, and there's only so much that I can actually put on a video like this. Like, that's really something I want to drill down on here, is I get a lot of comments on these day 1 videos talking about like how inaccessible they make the game feel, and I want you to know that these are just the decks that I really like and I've been doing well with. That's all they are. The decks that I and my friends have been succeeding with. They are not meant, these videos are not meant to put a limiter on the world of what you think the game can be. They're meant to show you what people are doing right now so you can go out and beat it. Okay? Please, please, please take that to heart. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.